James the Just, brother of Jesus. In 62 CE, in Jerusalem, the high priest Ananus ordered his guards to arrest James, the brother of Jesus, who had spent years leading the Christian community and preaching in the temple that Jesus was the Messiah. Ananus had long wanted James dead for spreading this message, but Roman law required the governor's permission for any execution. When the Roman governor Festus died and his replacement had not yet reached Judea, Ananus saw his opportunity and assembled the Jewish council without waiting for Roman authorization. The council accused James of blasphemy and sentenced him to death by stoning. Guards dragged James to the temple pinnacle, a platform 100 feet above the stone courtyard where crowds gathered below. The priests at the top demanded James denounce Jesus before the crowd, but James shouted down that Jesus rose from death and would return. Furious priests rushed forward, grabbed James, and hurled him off the platform. His body plummeted 100 feet and slammed into the stone pavement, shattering bones throughout his body. James survived the impact and remained conscious. As people rushed down, he dragged himself to his knees and prayed aloud, asking God to forgive his attackers. The crowd surrounded him and began hurling stones, rocks smashing into his face and body as he knelt praying. A launderer from a nearby workshop pushed through the crowd carrying the heavy wooden club he used to beat dirt from cloth. He raised the club and brought it crashing down on James's skull, crushing his head and killing him instantly. News of the execution spread through Jerusalem, and even non-Christian Jews protested that Ananus had killed James illegally, without Roman permission. When the new governor Albinus arrived weeks later, angry citizens met him on the road demanding justice. Within 3 months, King Agrippa removed Ananus from the priesthood as punishment, and James's followers buried him beside the temple, where they placed a marker over his grave that stood for over a century. Herod the Great. In 4 BCE, in Jericho, Herod the Great was running Judea like a paranoid tyrant, pointing at suspected traitors while executioners hauled them screaming toward chopping blocks. This was a king who had watched guards wrap a rope around his wife Mariamne's neck and squeeze until she stopped kicking, and later stood watching his sons march past in chains toward execution for plotting against him. But during his last year, something started eating him from inside that he couldn't execute. Sweat constantly streamed down his face as fever burned through his body, and he tore bloody scratches across his arms because his skin itched so badly that clawing brought zero relief. His stomach and feet swelled with fluid until the skin stretched tight, and when advisors walked in, they'd get hit with his rotting breath and stumble backward with hands over their mouths. His body would randomly lock up, and he'd topple from his chair, convulsing on the floor, while servants grabbed his arms to keep him from cracking his skull. Then one morning, he looked down and saw his genitals turning black and rotting on his living body. Dead tissue spread like spilled ink, and within days, flies landed on the flesh, laying eggs into the wounds. Herod felt those eggs squirming under his skin before they hatched into maggots that burrowed deeper, eating through his groin while he sat fully conscious of every worm crawling inside him. Servants knelt with tools, scooping out handfuls of writhing maggots, while Herod gripped his chair screaming, but every morning fresh batches crawled inside him. Physicians poured oil over the tissue and packed wounds with honey while Herod shook from pain, but nothing stopped the rot from spreading. The agony got so bad he grabbed a dagger and raised it to his throat, but his cousin tackled him and wrestled it away. Attendants kept him sitting upright because lying down made him choke. He died on March 13th, 4 BCE, and when servants tried lifting his body, their fingers sank into flesh that peeled off the bone. John the Baptist. In 28 CE, at the fortress of Machaerus, perched on cliffs overlooking the Dead Sea, Herod Antipas threw John the Baptist into a prison cell deep beneath the stone floors. John had spent years wandering the Judean wilderness wearing camel hair and a leather belt, surviving on locusts and wild honey while preaching to massive crowds along the Jordan River. But John had made one fatal mistake. He stood in front of crowds and publicly called out Herod for divorcing his wife and marrying Herodias, his brother's wife and his own niece, declaring the marriage unlawful. Herodias heard about it and immediately wanted him dead. Months later, Herod threw himself a lavish birthday banquet, filling the halls with military officers and nobility drinking wine and feasting. During the celebration, Herodias' daughter Salome stepped into the center and began dancing for the guests in ways that captivated everyone watching, especially Herod, who sat transfixed. When she finished, Herod stood up and made a public oath in front of everyone, declaring he would give her anything she wanted, even up to half his kingdom. Salome walked out and found her mother waiting in the shadows. After whispering together, Salome walked back in and stopped directly in front of Herod, demanding the head of John the Baptist brought to her immediately on a platter. Herod's face went pale because he was trapped by his public oath, so he turned to a soldier standing nearby and gave the order. The soldier walked down stone stairs into the prison, drew his sword as he approached John's cell, and with one swing beheaded the prophet. He picked up John's severed head by the hair, placed it on a silver platter, and carried it back upstairs where the banquet had gone completely silent. He walked across the room and presented the platter to Salome, who took it with both hands and walked it over to her mother Herodias. When John's disciples heard what happened, they traveled to Machaerus, retrieved his headless body, and buried it in a tomb. James, son of Zebedee. In 44 CE, in Jerusalem, Herod Agrippa I, the grandson of Herod the Great, who decades earlier had died as maggots devoured his rotting genitals, arrested several followers of Jesus Christ. Agrippa had won his throne only 3 years earlier through political maneuvering in Rome, but he ruled over a population controlled by powerful Jewish religious leaders who could turn the people against him. These Jewish leaders hated the growing movement of Jesus' followers, viewing them as a threat to their religious authority, and they pressured Agrippa to take action against the Christians. Agrippa decided to give them what they wanted. He would execute prominent Christians to prove his loyalty to the Jewish leaders. Among his first targets was James, one of the 12 men who had walked with Jesus during his ministry and witnessed his crucifixion. James had become a leader among the followers in Jerusalem, boldly preaching about Jesus in the temple courts despite the danger. Herod Agrippa sent soldiers to arrest James, and without holding any trial or public hearing, he immediately ordered the execution. A soldier led James to the execution site, drew his sword, and with one powerful stroke beheaded him. James became the first of Jesus' 12 apostles to be killed for his faith, dying approximately 14 years after Jesus had been crucified. Blandina. In 177 CE, in the Roman city of Lyon, guards arrested Blandina, a 15-year-old Christian slave girl, along with dozens of other believers after a mob accused them of cannibalism and incest. The Roman authorities threw Blandina and the other Christians into prison, and when interrogators tortured her from morning until evening to force a confession, she repeated only one phrase: that she was a Christian and her people did nothing evil. The torturers became exhausted and admitted they had no more methods to try, so the governor sentenced Blandina to death in the arena along with her fellow Christians during the summer gladiator games. On the first day of executions, guards tied Blandina to a wooden stake and released wild animals into the arena, but the beasts circled her without attacking, and she was dragged back to her cell. Days later, executioners brought Blandina back to the arena and forced her to sit on a red-hot iron chair, the heated metal searing her flesh and filling the air with smoke as her skin burned. Blandina survived the burning chair, and on the final day of the games, guards wrapped her in a net and threw her before an enraged bull that gored and tossed her repeatedly with its horns. The crowd, stunned that she remained alive after everything, shouted for her suffering to end, and executioners finally beheaded her with a sword. Guards left Blandina's body and the corpses of the other martyrs exposed in the arena for 6 days before burning them and throwing the ashes into the Rhone River to prevent Christians from recovering the remains. Ignatius of Antioch. In 107 CE, in the city of Antioch, Roman soldiers entered the Christian meeting house, seized Ignatius, the elderly bishop, and dragged him before the Roman governor. The governor condemned Ignatius to death for refusing to worship the Roman gods, and ordered guards to chain him to 10 soldiers who would march him to Rome, where he would be thrown to wild beasts in the Colosseum. The journey took months, and during the march, Ignatius told everyone who would listen that he longed to be devoured by lions and would not allow anyone to interfere with his death. When Ignatius arrived in Rome, guards marched him through the streets to the Colosseum, where tens of thousands of Romans had packed the stone seats to watch criminals die and gladiators fight. Officials dragged Ignatius onto the sandy arena floor and gave him one final chance to renounce Christ, but he shouted that he refused and wanted the beast to tear him apart. Guards opened an iron gate, and 2 starving lions ran into the arena, spotted Ignatius, and charged at him. The lions attacked Ignatius and knocked him to the ground, sank their teeth into his flesh, and began ripping him apart as he prayed aloud. Within minutes, the beasts had devoured most of his body, leaving only his bones scattered across the blood-soaked sand. After the crowd left the Colosseum, Christians who had watched the execution walked onto the arena floor, gathered Ignatius's bones, and buried them with honors.